Thank you, Mayor Stewart, for the introduction. Can I also acknowledge Ross Patterson, Mayor of Western Bay, is here tonight. Gray is the head of the local UN Association, Murray is the chair, and everyone who's made tonight's event possible. And I'd also like to thank the UN Association here in Tauranga for keeping the flag flying for the UN here in the Bay. Around the world, the UN is backed by groups of dedicated volunteers like your local association. And they do it because, as our student set out, people believe in the ideals and the purpose of the UN. And so do I, and always have. And it's a privilege for me now to be based in New York, heading the UN Development Program and able to contribute something directly. So I thought I'd start tonight with a little bit of context before coming to the challenges and the possibilities in development. Everyone here knows of the United Nations. Many may also know that our former Prime Minister, the Right Honourable Peter Fraser, was at the founding conference in San Francisco in 1945. In fact, I think history records that he went up there by a flying boat, a Catalina flying boat. He touched down in Tokelau, making the first ever visit of a New Zealand Prime Minister there, and island hopped up to the west coast of the United States of America. Those people who convened in San Francisco wrote the Charter of the UN, and it was visionary. And remember the times in which it was written. It was towards the end of World War II. The League of Nations, which had preceded the UN after the First World War, had not been able to prevent a major world war breaking out again. So people were having a fresh go at designing, if you like, a world where people would live in peace and be free of fear and want. And when they designed that organisation, it quite explicitly had three pillars to it. One was peace and security, and often when we hear about the UN, it's on these huge issues of war, conflict, security, Afghanistan, Syria, the Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo. That gets a lot of profile, and those issues are very, very tough. So peace and security was one pillar, human rights was another, and development was a third. And they're all interlinked, because actually you don't achieve a high state of human development if your country's mired in deep conflict. You don't achieve a high state of human development without human rights. So these things need to be seen as a package. Then from 1945, the UN began to develop its institutions. And again, some of them are familiar to us. We hear about the Security Council. New Zealand is bidding to be on it again at the moment, so we will hear more than usual. We hear about the UN General Assembly, where all the 193 member states are assembled. We don't hear so much about the Economic and Social Council, but it's important. It has commissions under it. Then, organisationally, there is a secretariat that's headed by the Secretary-General, and it has big departments, the most substantive of which are the Department of Political Affairs and the Department of Peacekeeping. Now, the two main bases of the UN, we could say, are in New York and also in Geneva, where there is the Palais des Nations, where some of the UN's funds and programs and specialised agencies are too. But then come to the part of the UN that I lead, the development arm. Now, my organisation, UN Development Program, is headquartered in New York. So are some sister programs like UNICEF, which works for children, the UN Population Fund, which works on demography and sexual and reproductive health issues, and so is the new UN Women. In Geneva, there are many of the specialised agencies, the ILO, the WHO, there's the UN High Commission for Refugees, the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, there's UNAIDS, there's the sister organisation, the World Trade Organisation, there's the International Telecommunications Organisation. And then in Paris, you have UNESCO headquartered. In Rome, you have what we call the three food agencies, the World Food Programme, which is humanitarian, the Food and Agriculture Organisation, which is standard setting and technical assistance. And then there's a third one called IFAD, the International Fund for Agricultural Development, which is a fund and a bank. In Vienna, you have UNIDO, which is industrial development, the Atomic Energy Agency, and then you have big UN campuses in Nairobi and in Copenhagen, and then where the economic commissions for the regions are, for Africa and Addis Ababa, for Asia Pacific in Bangkok, for Latin America and the Caribbean in Santiago, for the Arab States region in Beirut, and then for Europe in Geneva. So this is a big organisation, and it has many, many arms. For the specialised agencies and the funds and programs like UNDP, we have our own boards. We answer to our boards. The Secretary General brings together a meeting twice a year, which has the chief executives of all the multilateral organisations in the world coming to it, and that also includes the IMF and the World Bank and the World Trade Organisation and so on. One way or another, New Zealand, like all 193 member states, has a connection with virtually every part of this system. And we tend to manage the different relationships through different ministries. Obviously, Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade is a very important manager of the relationships, but so is the Health Department of the World Health Organization, the agriculture people here with the FAO, and so on. So let me come to my part of this big organisation. UNDP, which has been going in one form or another since the 1950s. It has a presence of some kind in 177 developing countries and territories. It has somewhere around 130 full country offices, some of them, like the one in Fiji, multi-country offices serving 10 countries. So it's like running a very, very big diplomatic service with the UNDP embassies, if you like, in so many places, but actually very focused on doing practical things for development. But because UNDP is this big, universally present organisation, it's also the anchor agency for the whole UN development system. So the head of UNDP chairs this organisation of all the UN arms which have anything to do with development. At the regional level, our directors chair the regional directors group. And if you come down to the country office and go to any developing country, there will be a UN country team, which is led by the UNDP resident representative. And that person is normally the most senior UN official in a developing country. Now, this is a big responsibility because, for example, most of the world's countries in some kind of deep trouble don't have a UN peacekeeping mission or a UN political mission there. It is the UNDP resident representative who is the most senior official. That is the case in Syria today, in profound conflict, in Egypt, in Zimbabwe, in Guinea, in the Maldives, in Nepal, in Colombia. You know, so many countries experience quite profound trauma. The most senior official is the leader of our organisation. So let me come to the topic of the challenges and the achievements we face together in building a better world. At UNDP, we see all the challenges and we see the achievements because we work across the whole spectrum of developing countries, all the way from Somalia, which is probably the very lowest on the Human Development Index, all the way across to the very high-income developing countries of the Gulf. But high-income developing countries can have issues as well. Think of Bahrain, which has been in very considerable civil strife throughout the period of the Arab states' uprisings. Very high GDP per capita, but it hasn't made for happiness. So we work at the interface of a lot of issues, the peace and security issues, the human rights issues, and the plain, ordinary economic and social development issues linked to environmental sustainability and building resilience to crisis and disaster. And we're currently updating our own strategic plan around that, promoting sustainable development, promoting democratic governance and people having voice and the right to express their views and participate, and then this building resilience to disaster and shock, which knocks so many countries flat so regularly. And right across what we do, we promote gender equality and the empowerment of women and girls. At the heart of what an organisation like UNDP does is it builds capacity for people to help themselves. We are not a charity and we're not a bank. We are an enabler of development through bringing good ideas and perspectives to help countries design their own systems and strategies, policies and actions. So, the challenges. When I went up to New York in April 2009, it was widely perceived as being a time of multiple crises around the world. Obviously, the economic and financial crisis from the meltdown in the financial markets of New York and London had played a very big part in that. We were also seeing a series of mega disasters, both climatic and seismic, and ongoing war and conflict in a lot of places. And I'm afraid not a lot has changed since. Back in 2000, I had gone to the Millennium Summit of the United Nations as a young Prime Minister. And I remember the new millennium was pitched as a time of hope. Could we build a better 21st century than the 20th century the world had just been through with its two major world wars, the atomic bombs, famine, and other catastrophe? Well, it's work in progress, isn't it? Because we still see so much violence and conflict. We still see the mega disasters, and no country is immune, as we know ourselves. So let's run through some of those issues. On the world economy, yes, it's true that this global financial meltdown, the IMF action and the G20 action did help stop a slump of the dimensions which followed the 1929 Wall Street crash. But this is taking a long time to come out of. Every few months I go to a meeting of the G20 finance ministers representing the UN. And so I hear a lot around what the developed economies, the largest ones, and the big emerging economies are thinking and saying. And the truth is that sustained growth is still eluding most of the developed world economies. Now, to a large extent, the major emerging economies have been holding up the world economy, but they are having a slow year. And if you look at what we call the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, they are having their worst year of growth in rather a long time. So they can't carry the burden of continued growth. Then you go to regions which have been growing like Africa, and this starts to get us into some of the complexities of growth. Reasonable rates of growth, but not enough poverty reduction. Why? Because the growth is not inclusive. A lot of it has been generated off the extractive industries, off the mining, and not much goes back in to benefit people. And of course, the environmental degradation that Africa and other parts of the world have experienced isn't helping either. And so we need to be looking at growth which is both inclusive and sustainable if we're going to rise to the challenges of eradicating poverty. And I'll come back to that. But for now, we see economies not performing well, putting a lot of pressure on people. People around the world fear for their future. Can they feed their families? Will they ever get ahead? Will youth ever find work? Actually, the world has a jobs crisis. There are rather more than 200 million people out of work now. This huge youth demographic that's coming through needs hundreds of millions of more jobs and livelihoods created for it. Young people are carrying the burden of unemployment around the world in both so-called advanced and developing countries. In Spain, youth unemployment tops 50% at this time. Horrific. So, the consequence of economic failure and underperformance adds up to an unrest. And we see it in the Occupy movements and the protests in the developed countries. But there we also see democracy acting as a shock absorber, because it is possible to change governments at the ballot box. But when you combine economic exclusion, people being shut out from opportunity to work and earn a living, when you combine that with political exclusion and lack of legitimate channels to express concerns, then frustration does boil over. And we saw that with the series of Arab states uprisings starting at the beginning of at the end of 2010, when the young unemployed Tunisian self-immolated, burnt himself to death, triggered an uprising in Tunisia, and you saw the ripples go right round the Arab states region. The basic trigger, I believe, was the economic hardship. People very vulnerable to poverty, high levels of unemployment, particularly among educated youth who are more unemployed than uneducated youth in the region. And we have, as you know from turning on the TV every night, by no means seen the end of these very troubled transitions in the Arab states regions. You could see what's happening there also as the latest of a series of waves of democratization around our world. Since the fall of the Berlin Wall and the breakup of the Soviet Union and the breakup of the former Yugoslavia. And these transitions can be very, very bloody. We also saw, going back to the 90s, particularly movements to democracy in Latin America, away from dictatorship and away from authoritarian rule. These kinds of transitions are playing out in the Arab states region today. They are very, very bumpy transitions. Then also on the challenges front, you have the ongoing fragility in countries which are affected in the here and now by conflict or are trying to come out of it. Afghanistan, Iraq, Somalia, Central African Republic, Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo. In the Sahel, Mali tipped right over, going back over a year. Now, I mention that because if the world is to set its sights on eradicating extreme poverty, it has to eradicate it in countries like that. War-torn, often very exposed to natural disaster as well, where the state and its institutions are generally quite weak. Put these things together, it does tend to coincide with high levels of extreme poverty. And what we're seeing with extreme poverty is as these major emerging economies like China are succeeding in lifting, and in China's case have already lifted hundreds of millions of people out of extreme poverty, and India will follow the same path. Project forward a generation, extreme poverty will be in countries which are not at peace, have very weak states, and lack resilience to the shocks which come along and knock countries over. Now, one of the big areas of shock, and this has emerged as one of the biggest challenges to development, is what is happening to the world's climate. We have these traumatic extreme weather events, hurricanes, tornadoes, and drought in the USA. The high summer temperatures, heavy flooding, extreme winters of Europe. Here in New Zealand, we get a bit of everything. A bit of heavy rain, a horrible drought last year in the Waikato, an extended area. We get our flooding, we get our heavy snows. And this matters to our agriculture, because to be an efficient primary producer, you need to have a temperate and equable climate. So then take it into the developing world. The huge flooding we've seen in Asia, in Colombia and Latin America, in Africa, the cyclones of Bangladesh, the severe droughts in the Horn of Africa and the Sahel. Building resilience to these events is a huge challenge, and working to stop catastrophic global warming is an even bigger challenge. Now, just to say a little more about that, when I was Prime Minister, we were always told that the world had to work extremely hard to keep the rise in global temperatures below 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. If you follow the debate on this now, you will see serious projections from very credible forecasters talking about the world being on course for 6 degrees. If 2 degrees was catastrophic, what will 6 do? It doesn't bear thinking about. And the date has been set for 2015 to try to get a breakthrough on the climate negotiations, which would see countries making firm commitments to act in a way which would keep global temperatures below the 2 degree rise. We are some way off that agreement at the moment. Also on the mega trends and challenges, well, there are the demographic pressures. Roughly 7 billion of us today. By 2050, there will be at least 9.3 billion of us. Almost all that extra 2.3 billion people will be absorbed in cities. Our cities in the world are expected to rise in population from around 3.6 billion of 2011 to 6.3 billion by 2050. Well, 68% of the world's population will be in cities. Now, the head of UN Habitat, one of our sister agencies, makes the point that this is the first era of human history where urbanisation is proceeding without industrialisation, which raises the question of where will the jobs, the livelihoods for these burgeoning cities come? How will we cope with the food supply? Can we keep up with the health and education and other services? What about the opportunities for young people? What about urban governance? Urban governance is going to become extremely important to cater for these huge metropolitan populations. And then also on demographics, we have the youth wave coming through, which is a huge opportunity if you invest in it, but a liability if you don't, and youth are angry and alienated and frustrated. And then you also have the ageing demographic, which is beginning to affect many developing countries as well. In 2007, 11% of us were over 60. By 2050, that'll be 22%. So the world will need pension systems and security systems to cope for that. So, now on the opportunity side, what can be done about it? Well, for some time now, the international community has been focusing on what the next global development agenda is going to look like. Now, to comprehend that, you need to know what the last one looked like. And the last one was flowing out of the Millennium Declaration of the UN Millennium Summit, which I went to in 2000. And from that summit, these Millennium Development Goals were set. There were 8 of them. There were sub-targets. They were very clear. You could measure the progress. And actually, quite a lot has been achieved. Because developing countries embrace them, they put them in their national development plans. Many regions and cities put them in their plans. And the donor countries, like New Zealand, America, Japan, Britain, countries of Europe, also embraced them and tended to channel their funding to the priorities of the Millennium Development Goals, particularly health and education. Now, quite a lot has been achieved on those goals, but there's unfinished business for the next agenda. So goal 1 was around cutting in half the proportion of the world's people who live in extreme poverty, on under $1.25 a day. Actually, that target has been achieved, which is fantastic if you're in the 1 billion that it helped. But if you're in the 1 billion left behind, it's not so great. That's unfinished business. And there's similar numbers around the numbers of people living in hunger, going to bed hungry every night. Second goal was around education and having every child enrolled in primary school. Well, it's close. The world is down to 60 million children who are not in school. But the quality hasn't expanded with the quantity, and it doesn't take a genius to work out that primary schooling is a very important basis for future life, but you need to be able to go further. Unfinished business. Gender empowerment was the third goal, and there was a specific target set for 30% of members of the world's national parliaments to be female. On average, the figure is about 20%. So we haven't reached that one. On the other hand, if a goal hadn't been set, would it have been taken seriously as an issue for action at all? Infant and child health targets have been quite successful. That was goal 4. Goal 5 was reducing maternal mortality and having universal access to sexual and reproductive health services. This goal has probably done the worst. And that speaks a lot for the status of women around the world, the low priority given to women's health and issues. We are involved at the moment in very determined efforts to accelerate progress on these goals. And a number of countries have chosen maternal mortality as an area for action. And you can see a lot of things that can be done to lower maternal death rates. For example, making sure that women are covered by a national health insurance scheme in Ghana, or making sure there's free transport to a health facility when you're giving birth. But there are issues that require much more profound change in a society to bring down maternal death rates. In Ghana, and Ghana is not alone in this, the highest rate of maternal death is among 12 to 15-year-old girls, who, in my opinion, should be in school and should not be in marriage and having their children. So until there's a lot of social mobilisation around that issue to change aspirations for the lives of girls, it is very hard to reduce maternal mortality to the absolutely minimal level. Sixth area of goals was HIV and AIDS, and the tide has turned on HIV and AIDS and on malaria and on TB, targeted illnesses. But, of course, on malaria, it happened because there was a huge campaign on bed nets. Well, bed nets eventually need to be replaced. Will there be the same focus on that? On TB, the superbugs and the drug-resistant TB is still a problem. On HIV, I think we see a little complacency setting in, and to some extent in our own country, where infections started to just pick up a little bit. You can never lose vigilance on a deadly disease for which at this time there is no cure. I was recently in Uganda, which had one of the highest rates of prevalence of HIV, coming out of a history of war and conflict, and with strong leadership they cut that back. The prevalence now, or did bottom out at 6%, which is still rather high. It has now ticked up again to 7.5%. And the absolute number of infections every year in Uganda today is higher than it was when the prevalence was up in the 20s because of the population growth. So with figures like that, we can't really say the war is won. It needs a lot of continued effort. There was a 7th MDG on what was called environmental broadly, the water goal largely achieved, sanitation goal woeful. The very charismatic Minister of Rural Affairs in India, who was on a platform for a UNDP conference I was at last year there, and he got a cell phone out of his pocket and he waved it. He said, "What's wrong with my country? Everyone's got one of these and hardly anyone's got a toilet. Where are our priorities?" Fair point, fair point. Sanitation has not had a lot of attention. But the other goals there on preserving forest cover, biodiversity, marine reserves, climate change, they haven't done quite so well either. And then there was an 8th goal about partnership, about global partnerships for development. And the truth is the promises that countries have made about official development assistance haven't really been kept either by most. So when we talk about a new development agenda to tackle the big challenges, it's talking about after 2015, which is the target date for these Millennium Development Goals, what should be done? There's obviously unfinished business, but there's also a view coming out that we need an agenda which is universal and seeks to be transformative, that really lifts us to a much bigger picture of development as affecting all of us, developed and developing countries alike, and that we need to be much more consciously linking poverty reduction with environmental sustainability, because extreme poverty and environmental degradation reinforce each other. Last year was the big Rio +20 UN conference on sustainable development. And that conference called for developing a set of SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals, which would cover the 3 strands of sustainability: economic, social, and environmental. And this post-2015 agenda, which is now being debated, is a chance to have a comprehensive agenda across those 3 strands. So what's happening on it? Well, firstly, huge outreach by the UN development system. Led by UNDP, we have had national consultations in around 100, almost entirely developing countries. And we have gone out to get the voices of the voiceless, of the marginalised people and groups, make sure women are heard, young people are heard, on what sort of future do you want? What would you like the global agenda to focus on? There's also been a series of consultations around big themes: where to go in health, education, issue of inequalities, conflict and development, environmental sustainability, etc. And we've reached out through a huge online survey where more than probably 1 million people have participated now. And what's coming through all the consultation is people say, look, those MDGs were good, but there's unfinished business. Don't forget about it. Don't forget that 1 billion people haven't yet been lifted out of extreme poverty or hunger. Secondly, they're saying, we want you to focus on the quality of services, not just the quantity. We want to know that not just that our child is sitting in school, but that they're learning something while they're there. And don't stop the ambition for universal education with primary schooling. It needs to go on to secondary and skills training and beyond as well. Thirdly, people are saying focus on inequalities. And the groups who feel marginalised, often people with disabilities, Indigenous people, ethnic minorities, youth, and yes, women, are saying, count us in. Often when you give an average of progress, we're invisible, and yet we are the ones who may be missing out on the progress of a country. And very interestingly, an issue that has come through loud and clear is people want honest and effective government. Doesn't seem too much to ask, does it? But people feel, in many cases, they don't have it, and they want to focus on the next agenda on that. Now, where are we going to go from here? Because UN member states find it very easy to rally around targets on poverty, targets on reducing hunger, targets on health and education. But will they, in a new agenda, be prepared to target better governance, rule of law, reduction of conflict? If those things aren't targeted, then I come back to the point about extreme poverty overlapping with states wrecked by conflict, wrecked by weak governance, wrecked by being disaster prone, wrecked by lack of the rule of law or human rights. So we have gathered all this feedback. We brief the member states. New Zealand is a member state. Member states will negotiate the next development agenda. This is a different process from 2000, where the agenda was in essence drawn up at the request of Kofi Annan. It wasn't a negotiated agenda, although it was foreshadowed in the Millennium Declaration, which was. From early this year, there has been an open working group at the UN working on sustainable development goals, and it'll report at the end of next year, September. And it's thought that probably around then the member states will start to negotiate a new agenda, hopefully with goals and targets, to have it settled for a World Summit in September 2015. And that's a big year for 2 other reasons as well. One, it's the year when we really need the new climate agreement to be settled. And secondly, it's also a year for a new agenda on disaster risk reduction, which is a big international agenda as well. These things are all linked. So, assisting the post-2015 debate, apart from the huge outreach efforts that we've been doing through the UN, has been a high-level panel the Secretary-General set up. And it reported in May. For anyone interested in this topic, Google high-level panel on post-2015. It's on the web. And it's well worth reading. It was co-chaired by David Cameron, the British Prime Minister, the Indonesian President, and the Liberian President. And it calls for what it calls 5 big transformative shifts in our thinking about development for all of us, rich and poor countries, with the following principles. Leave no one behind, because inequalities are corrosive. In extremis, they are explosive. They limit the potential of people and of countries. They're unfair and unjust. And this issue of inequalities is not only dominating international debate among member states, it's also starting to dominate the big corporate summits like Davos. Inequalities, the contribution to instability, to undermining progress. Second big principle, put sustainable development at the core of the agenda. We have to have an integrated vision where we don't seek to grow and develop at the price of destroying the planet. This is self-defeating. That must be a very conscious strand of the new agenda. Thirdly, big principle, transforming economies for jobs and inclusive growth. Because this headline growth that doesn't create a wage people can live on, a livelihood people can live on, is not satisfying at all. So we need job-rich strategies. And I would add in here, take the opportunity of the transition to the green economy for more jobs, exports of goods and services, innovation and growth. The transition through clean energy, energy efficiency, better transport systems, urban design, the way we produce and consume. There are actually huge opportunities in this agenda if we look at the opportunity cost and not just the short-term costs of doing things. Fourth big principle, build peace and effective, open and accountable institutions. Noting again how closely linked peace, better governance, the rule of law and human rights are. This will be challenging for the member states, so we'll need a lot of advocacy. And fifth big principle, form a new global partnership. Development is not just about how much development assistance there is, important as that is. We need to inspire governments, national and local, the international organisations, the civil society organisations working in development, the foundations, the scientific and academic communities, and yes, the private sector as well, to work around a unifying vision for development. Everybody has a part to play. Now, to achieve that, the high-level panel says, and I agree, the agenda needs to have goals set which solve a critical issue, carry a compelling message, are easy to understand and communicate, are measurable, can be widely applied, are grounded in the voices of people and what they are seeking, and are consensus-based. And so they then, on the basis of that, in the report, propose around 12 areas of goals, which build on the MDGs and go beyond them. Certainly goal 1, to end poverty. And entwined with that, they advocate for effective social security systems, called social protection mainly internationally. And bear in mind that the countries we know as developed countries today, like our own, we didn't introduce social security when we were rich. We introduced it when we were rather poor. Same with America and the New Deal. Same with Britain at the end of the war. Social security is a part of development. It underwrites living standards so people can't slip back into abject poverty. And it also advocates, as part of ending poverty, an emphasis on disaster risk reduction and building resilience. Secondly, and obviously, empowering girls and women and achieving gender equality. And it suggests specific targets there, targeting violence against women, enforcement of the age of marriage so that girls aren't forced into early marriage, equal rights under the law, You know, we work in many countries where, for example, a woman farmer cannot be as productive as a man because she can't own her land. She can't borrow money. You know, she can't inherit land from her family. She may not even be able to open a bank account. She can't access the same advisory services. So there are women making up probably more than half of sub-Saharan Africa's farmers, but they can't produce as much. They can't earn as much. They can't contribute as much to food security and ending hunger because of a lack of basic status and rights. So these things have to be tackled. Education comes through very strongly in this proposed new set of goals, particularly focusing on quality, basic competencies, reading, writing, counting, and getting the transition through to secondary and further education. That's extremely important. There must be a health goal, and again, it needs to be a universal vision for health, tackling not just the 3 diseases that were specified in the MDGs, but also bringing in the non-communicable diseases. Now, in our own country, these NCDs, as they're called, the big killers, the tobacco, the heart disease, the stroke, the high blood pressures, you know, these things are now taking a heavy toll in developing countries as well. They need to be tackled, and the social and economic determinants of health need to be addressed. So they suggest targets in this area and around vaccination and around universal access to sexual and reproductive health. In sub-Saharan Africa, when I travel, I always look at what the access to those services are, and commonly about 30% plus of women say they cannot access services when they would like to. There would be a goal on food security and good nutrition, and important to emphasise nutrition because you can get enough calories, but it may not be nutritious food, and that is what can cause the stunting and the problems with children's development. Yes, universal access to safe water and clean sanitation should be a goal. There's also a goal suggested around sustainable energy for all. Over 1 billion people do not have access to electricity at all in the world today, not as much as an electric light bulb in the whole home. And close to 2.5 billion depend on what we call traditional biomass, which is usually wood from the tree, which is getting further and further away from the home because the forest's cover is depleted. They depend on that for cooking and heating. So sustainable energy is extremely important. There will be an emphasis, I think, in the new goals on jobs, livelihoods, and equitable growth. There should be one on managing natural assets sustainably. The big challenge, getting one on good governance and effective institutions, and the high-level panel suggests targeting corruption, which is very corrosive of development, a right to information, a right to political expression and participation. Then they suggest a goal around stability and peace, which I've really emphasised tonight, maybe targeting reduction in the number of violent deaths and security sector reform issues. And then finally, a global enabling environment for development, fair trade, financial system stability, living up to promises on official development assistance and targeting climate change. So this could be a big and ambitious agenda, and really we need no less when you look at the challenges that are out there. I think it makes a difference to have a clear international agenda, which directs action and directs money to where the need is. And when we look back at the MDGs, there are areas like health and education where much more progress has been made than the world was trending for before these goals. We can show, for example, that on the health goals of the MDGs, the burden of disease is much less now than it was before the MDGs kicked in. So we need to think bigger and bolder if we're going to build a world which tackles these challenges and which is more inclusive, more equitable, more sustainable, more fair, more just, and more resilient to shock. That is the challenge. But I hope I've also outlined tonight that there's a lot of opportunity here, and opportunity for all of us to rally round an agenda which could realise a better future for all of us. Thank you.
Good one. We've been told that the poor will be with us always. Why does the UN think it can cure poverty? Or does the UN think it can cure poverty?
Well, because the UN alone can't cure poverty. Poverty has to be eradicated because countries care enough about the well-being of their people to target it and to grow and develop in a certain way. Now, of course, there is relative poverty. There's relative poverty in our own country. There's relative poverty in the United States of America. Relative poverty in every country. But the abject grinding poverty that goes with living on under $1.25 a day is something that should be eradicated. And frankly, once it's eradicated under $1.25 a day, we need to lift the bar on what is extreme poverty, because it's pretty miserable to live on under $2 a day as well. So yes, it can be. Our country, obviously, long ago eradicated extreme poverty. So did other developed countries. So have quite a lot of developing countries. It can be done. But it does require us to get into these deeper issues of how to bring a state of peace, how to build states and institutions, how to institute the rule of law, how to deal to the widespread corruption which is bleeding a number of developing countries dry. And these are challenging issues, and they shouldn't be overlooked in the next development agenda.
Thank you. The next one here is, the UN seems an incredibly complex and messy system of organisations. How does anybody know it's doing anything useful?
Well, I mean, in the agency's funds and programs like my own, we wouldn't be in business if people didn't think we were doing something useful. And we have to be very results oriented. I mean, the people who give us money, they want to see results. So in this new strategic plan we're drawing up at the moment, we're having a much tighter sort of results and indicators framework so that we can say, well, we said we'd do that, here's what we've achieved. In something like the Global Fund for Fighting AIDS, TB and Malaria, yes, we have to account for every cent. And the reason UNDP is active in this area is because the Global Fund funds treatment and prevention programs, particularly in the world's poorest countries. But in up to 30 of those countries, the Global Fund does not see a government honest enough or NGOs honest enough to take the money. So it comes to UNDP really as a provider of last resort. And then it's our job to make sure the money isn't stolen. And sometimes it is, and we have to crack down very hard and get the money back and deal with it. But we are very, very accountable for how we disperse the money and the results we get for it.